Since our series on the Sherman Brothers, I've been wanting to go back and look at least one of their efforts for the World's Fair, as our series on the Shermans mostly focused on their work in film, particularly with Mary Poppins. This week and next, we'll look at the creation of It's a Small World. Though it's been a few years, we've talked about Small World before, but this time, I want to place the ride into a larger political and cultural context. Walt wasn't just seeking to create an attraction that highlighted the work of UNICEF, a United Nations children's charity. He was speaking to a larger problem that was beginning to boil over in America. A problem that was largely overlooked by the fair as simply companies didn't want to sponsor an exhibit that explored tensions then exploding in American cities. Today, the ride, It's a Small World, is often viewed as a pleasant diversion on a trip to a Disney park, a colorful journey along an indoor flume where children of the world sing one of the most recognizable songs from the 20th century. But in the mid-1960s, this attraction, as well as that song by the Sherman Brothers, had a far deeper message. On Friday, December 14, 1962, President Kennedy left Edwards Air Force Base just outside Washington, D.C., and flew to Idlewild International, an airport that, after his assassination, would be named after him. The flight was short, lasting only an hour, and once he touched down, he was driven to Flushing Meadows in New York, a massive city park that decades earlier had been built on top of a dump. Initially, the park was arranged as the Borough of Queens version of Manhattan Central Park, but due to funding cutbacks, the finished park, though large, was not as elaborate or deeply landscaped as the more famous park on the other side of the city. Rather famously, Flushing Meadows had been the home to the 1939 New York World's Fair, a fair that, among other exhibits, had included a color Mickey Mouse cartoon as part of an exhibit area that celebrated both the art form of animation and packaged snacks available at the grocery store, as the exhibit had been sponsored by the National Biscuit Company, later renamed Nabisco. The 1939 fair had featured an endless line of international pavilions hosted by foreign governments who, as with all World's Fairs, were given rent-free space inside the grounds to create their exhibits. The upcoming 1964 World's Fair, however, would be different. Kennedy's plane landed in the afternoon. Then he was driven the 8 miles from the airport to the fair site. The drive took him past racially diverse neighborhoods, sections of New York far from the financial center of Wall Street. These were the streets on which average working Americans lived. Kennedy arrived at the grounds to find a gathering of men and women, many dressed in thick overcoats standing around an open area ringed by spectators. It wasn't snowing, but the air was brisk. Kennedy shook hands with Robert Moses, the president of the fair, and the two men approached a podium flanked by a military color guard. Moses spoke first, explaining how his team had, quote, combed the globe for pavilions and exhibits which would reflect the achievements of all men. What his speech neglected to explain, however, was the unusual nature of the 1964 World's Fair, as a fair that was not sanctioned by the Bureau of International Expositions. The Bureau of International Expositions, or the BIE, had rules that governed official World's Fairs. No country could host a fair more than once in a 10-year period. World's Fairs could only last 1 year. World's Fairs were required to offer land free of charge to foreign governments wishing to create a cultural pavilion. The New York Fair would break each of these rules primarily to increase its revenues. It would run for 2 summer seasons. It would charge rent to foreign governments, and it would begin in 1964, 2 years after the official 1962 World's Fair held in Seattle, so that the opening of the New York Fair would be aligned with the tricentennial of New York. Because of these things, the New York Fair was not an official fair, and as a result, member countries of the BIE were prohibited or strongly discouraged from participating. The result of this decision was a fair whose arrangement was different than those that preceded it. Some countries ignored the BIE regulation and participated anyway, but most BIE member countries stayed away, including Canada, Australia, and many European countries. In their place were smaller countries, such as Thailand, the Philippines, Mexico, Jordan, and others. The fair pursued loopholes in the BIE rules, inviting the Vatican as a means of representing European culture and art, and the city of West Berlin to represent Germany, as individual cities could represent international culture, even if member BIE nations could not. Along with this, the fair courted individual American states, such as Florida, Wisconsin, Missouri, and Hawaii, to create pavilions based on the culture and history of their region. But to fill out the largest fair spots, Robert Moses and his team primarily looked to corporations to create elaborate pavilions which featured exhibits of consumer goods and upcoming technology, along with attractions. One beneficiary of this decision was Walt Disney and his design firm WED Enterprises, as American companies wanted top-level rides and attractions to entice fair guests into visiting their pavilions and, as a result, also seeing their display of upcoming products. In 1961, Walt created a pitch book describing the type of attractions that his firm WED could create for interested companies. The attraction that Walt most wanted to sell to a corporation was called One Nation Under God, featuring the Hall of Presidents, a show that presented the history of America on screens and then transitioned into a presentation of animatronic presidents, with Lincoln rising to deliver a speech. Also on the list was an updated version of the Rocket to the Moon attraction, currently at Disneyland, and an updated version of America the Beautiful, a Circle Vision film also shown at Disneyland. Corporate America would buy none of these. Instead, by the time of that groundbreaking ceremony, Walt had two contracts. The Ford Motor Company hired WED to create the Magic Skyway, a ride in which guests moved through the history of transportation, from cavemen in the first cart to the future of automobiles, mostly focused on Ford cars. And for General Electric, a stage show featuring the history of electric conveniences, from simple inventions at the turn of the century to the great big beautiful tomorrow of appliances that would arrive in a few years. A few months after groundbreaking, Walt would have a third contract for a substantially pared-down version of One Nation Under God, featuring only an animatronic of President Lincoln, a show effectively co-sponsored by the state of Illinois and the fair itself. When Moses finished at the podium, discussing the wonders that his team would bring to the fair, he stepped away from the microphone as the small crowd around him, mostly standing, clapped in approval. President Kennedy, dressed in a suit, white shirt, and overcoat, then approached the mic. He was a young, exceedingly good-looking leader with a wave of dark hair swept back from his forehead, a leader who was able to see into both the problems of America and inspire hope that his leadership might help overcome them. His speech was short and direct, explaining that he hoped the fair would create a greater understanding between people of diverse cultures. In the early 1960s, America was moving through a period of cultural and racial intolerance, a period in which some institutions remained segregated and in which millions of people were standing up for equality. In the years leading up to the fair, African Americans entered white-only establishments insisting they be served. Public schools and universities, largely in the South, engaged racial integration, often with the protection of the police or the National Guard. Kennedy believed that America could do better in terms of seeking greatness, in part by creating equality and cultural compassion. Looking out at the small gathering, he said, This is what a World's Fair should be. About the theme of this World's Fair, peace through understanding, is most appropriate in these years of the 60s. I want the people of the world to visit this fair and all the various exhibits of our American industrial companies and the foreign companies who are most welcome, and to come to the American exhibit, the exhibit of the United States, and see what we have accomplished through a system of freedom. When the ceremony was finished, President Kennedy shook hands, posed for some photos, then returned to his motorcade, which would take him into Manhattan, where he would prepare another speech that he would give in a few hours to the Economic Club of New York. But Kennedy's speech highlighted a central problem for the fair. Though the fair was located in America, none of the exhibits or attractions focused on the underlying trouble then boiling up in the country, centered on racial equality. For the most part, exhibits and attractions so far arranged into the fair fell into three categories. 1. Cultural exhibits that were sponsored by a place, such as artworks presented by the Vatican. 2. Optimistic visions of the future, such as the Futurama attraction sponsored by General Motors, in which guests in moving chairs saw the city of the future. And 3, a nostalgic look at the past, such as a full-size recreation of the Santa Maria, a ship used by Christopher Columbus as part of the Spanish exhibit. Missing from the fair, at least so far, were exhibits that explored the current problems in America, focused on cultural and racial intolerance, along with plans intended to heal this divide. The first 3 Disney attractions for the fair fit nicely into this paradigm. Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln looked with nostalgia to the ideological success of America in the 18th and 19th centuries. Both the Ford Magic Skyway and the General Electric Carousel of Progress offered comic versions of the past and then hopeful visions of the future in which some minor problems outside of inequality might be solved through ingenuity and advanced consumer products. But it would be the 4th and final attraction contracted by Disney that would speak to the central problem then facing the country. Arranged through art and music, a message that would touch, if lightly, on the narrow-mindedness that underscored the largest problems in contemporary America. While Robert Moses and President Kennedy attended the groundbreaking ceremony in New York, on the other side of the continent, a team of designers working at a small facility in Glendale, California, were pushing ahead with plans for the Magic Skyway and the Carousel of Progress. At the same time, another group of engineers was working on the figure of Lincoln, with the hope that a deal would be reached to exhibit him at the fair. The work was exacting, taxing, exhilarating, and exhausting. In addition to the attractions for the World's Fair, some designers, engineers, and figure finishers were also working on mechanical birds for the Enchanted Tiki Room, scheduled to open at Disneyland later that summer. People arrived at the WED building early in the morning and often worked past quitting time. Then, one day, in February 1963, 2 months after the groundbreaking ceremony and 11 months before the attractions needed to be shipped to the fair site, Pepsi-Cola approached Disney with the possibility of creating one more attraction for the far end of the fair, one that Pepsi would underwrite but would benefit UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Relief Charity. This attraction would ideally present the children of the world and speak to a diversity of world cultures. The offer was not well received by Disney's chief of construction, Joe Fowler, who suggested that Walt pass on it, even though Pepsi had been a longtime sponsor of the Golden Horseshoe Revue at Disneyland, and UNICEF was a worthy charity. The creative team at WED, Fowler explained, was already overtaxed with their current assignments. Walt did not warm to this suggestion, saying, "I'll make those decisions. Tell Pepsi I'll do it." On February 15th, Walt arranged for a planning and feasibility study to be completed for the Pepsi UNICEF Pavilion with an eye toward making quick, simple design choices to complete a full pavilion attraction in under a year. Beyond this, Walt liked the proposal so much that even though he was charging $1 million to Ford and General Electric for the use of his name in their promotional materials, he said he would waive the fee for the use of his name on the ride that benefited UNICEF. In the days that followed, Walt told his employees at the WED complex, "There's one more piece of real estate left at the fair. I'd like to put a ride in there." Specifically, he wanted to build what he called a little boat ride. In a fair dominated by corporate exhibits focused on upcoming products and tourism, this little boat ride would be one of the few attractions entirely focused on a cultural message without a strong overlay of commercialism. Marty Sklar, a WED employee, recalled that everyone understood the time limitations. Quote, "There was no way you could possibly do a completed design mechanism and get it done in that amount of time." But the little boat ride, much to the surprise of the WED designers, would not be little at all. It would be a boat ride through the world's cultures, one of the few attractions that would gesture to the fair's overall theme, peace through understanding. The ride was tentatively named Children of the World, a ride that would also speak to Walt's growing interest in international culture. For much of the 1950s, Walt had produced a series of 17 documentary films, now mostly forgotten, called People and Places. These films, using embedded documentary camera teams, sought to capture unique world cultures for primarily an American audience. Cultures including the Alaskan Eskimo, the Blue Men of Morocco, the Ama girls of Japan, and the Mediterranean families of Sardinia. Like later Circle Vision films, the People and Places projects highlighted Walt's growing interest in internationalism, specifically the belief that film and other entertainments might provide an effective means of helping American audiences find connections with cultures different than their own. The series was nominated for 5 Academy Awards and won 2. In ways, the Children of the World attraction was a natural extension of Walt's efforts with the People and Places series, projects created through the belief that exposure to diversity led to cultural understanding and empathy. To begin work on the attraction, Walt needed an art director, what is now called a show director, to oversee the development of this attraction. The person that Walt initially had in mind was Mark Davis. Davis was perhaps best known for his work designing characters for the Pirates of the Caribbean. His work in nature was comic, often filled with visual gags, and occasionally leaned towards the grotesque, often presenting a character's interior motivation through humorous facial expressions and gestures. He was asked to sketch out the interiors, create scenes and gags, but Davis's quick concepts didn't capture Walt's interest. Rolly Crump recalled that Davis's drawings, quote, didn't have the child look that Walt wanted. After reviewing them, Walt considered other options. The person he most wanted to call was Mary Blair, an artist who had worked intermittently for the studio in the 1940s as a concept artist and later a color stylist. Her work radiated the simplicity of childhood, but the problem was she hadn't worked for the studio in a decade. 25 years earlier, Mary Blair had found her start in animation as a cel painter at the iWorks studio in Los Angeles. But by 1940, she was employed as a colorist and concept artist at Disney's, where her husband Lee also worked. Blair would work for a few months on a Disney project such as Dumbo or Fantasia, then she would retreat to her home studio to work on her own watercolors. During one of her breaks from the studio in 1941, Disney arranged to participate in a State Department-sponsored goodwill trip to South America. Essentially, as the Second World War expanded, the U.S. was looking to undermine Nazi influence in Latin America by sending a series of high-profile Hollywood celebrities to countries such as Argentina, hoping to persuade South Americans that their cultural ties to North America were far stronger than those they might have to Germany. For this trip, Walt selected a handful of artists, including Mary's husband, Lee, to venture to Brazil and other countries. The idea was that these artists would study South American art, music, and culture with an eye toward placing Latin elements into future cartoons to demonstrate the unity of North America with South America. Walt also invited one artist not currently working for the studio on the trip, Mary Blair. While away from the studio, concept artists, background painters, and animators explored ways to transform South American images and landscapes into elements for Disney cartoons. But this trip's influence on Blair was larger, more personal. Through extended exposure to South American culture, her sense of color began to change, as did her approach to character. The transformation in her art was so noticeable and inventive that, according to Blair herself, when she returned around the studio, she was given the nickname Marijuana Blair. It was, she said, because of, quote, the ideas she dreamed up. The most noticeable change, perhaps, was in her representation of children. In her watercolors, she began to present children in a way that reflected deep innocence, as well as a sense of playfulness and vulnerability. In these works, she aimed for a simple representation, a move that was very much out of step with the aesthetics of the larger studio, where lead male animators were striving for complexity and realism, such as with Bambi. Blair expanded a sense of flatness in her paintings, one that emphasized outline, another move that was out of step with a studio that was using equipment such as the multiplane camera to create the illusion of depth. Lastly, Blair embraced softness in her paintings, in contrast with the anatomical sharpness that many lead animators valued in their work. In short, during those years that the studio strived to make its animated features mimic the presentation of live-action films, Blair produced art that mimicked the type of flat illustration that one might find in old books. Her design style, in many ways, was moving against the grain of the in-house style at Disney. It was also the type of art, with minimal depth and figures designed for still life representation rather than for movement, that would be difficult to animate. Walt liked her work so much that, in an unusual move, he decided to use her watercolors by themselves without animation to tell the story of Las Posadas in the film The Three Caballeros. Las Posadas, a children's Christmas tradition in many South American countries, symbolically recreated Mary and Joseph's journey to find shelter before the birth of their child. In the Caballeros film, the entire sequence, like a Leica reel, was comprised of Mary Blair's paintings and nothing more. In terms of the Disney films, Mary Blair's art, specifically her character design of children, was a way to visually present characters regardless of their nationality as expressing universal emotions of joy, wonder, and excitement, and demonstrating deep human connections that tied together North, South, and Central America. In the late 1940s, Mary Blair saw animation as a, quote, new medium, just beginning to go places. But in her personal life, she also saw animation as a stepping stone, a way for her and her husband to support themselves until they made their way to Manhattan, which they viewed as the center of American art culture. The Blairs were expanding their family with the birth of two sons, one in 1947 and another in 1950. With them, Blair's interest in children as subjects expanded, particularly in how minimal images could express that pleasant simplicity of life. After leaving Disney and moving to New York, Blair used a similar approach to create images of children in advertising campaigns, such as for Baker's Instant Chocolate and Hanes Underwear. Mary Blair was a darling of the advertising world, while her husband managed a small animation and graphics studio. Blair's sense of design, modern, minimal, and flat, perfectly fit with the taste of many New York agencies who wished to create visual campaigns that bristled with modern images. One of her most famous and iconic advertising creations was of a young girl with pigtails that she created for the Meadow Gold Dairy, a girl featured in many ads for packaged ice cream. Aside from her work in advertising, Blair also used these stylized images of children when illustrating a series of little golden books for younger readers, such as I Can Fly. In both her advertising and publishing work, her children all appeared part of one extended family, as though the figures in I Can Fly were closely related to her pigtail girl developed for the Meadow Gold Dairy. In 1963, to move forward with the Children of the World project, Walt asked WED manager Dick Irvine to call Mary Blair and set up a meeting even though Blair and her family were in New York. Walt was hoping that Blair would be able to adapt her illustrations of children with their kind expressions, their spare features, and their slightly oversized heads into a series of international figures for the little boat ride. The ride eventually would include 350 characters, as well as sets that represented 26 countries or regions. But perhaps unbeknownst to Walt was this. Mary Blair had already done this, or at least something very similar. 8 years earlier, in 1955, Blair had converted the iconic Meadow Gold Girl into a life-size doll, a doll that was just over 2 feet tall, roughly the same height as those required for the Children of the World boat ride. The Blair dolls, with their simple features, had been sold for $3.50, mostly through mail order. Shortly after that initial conversation with Disney, Mary Blair agreed to join the Disney Pepsi UNICEF team specifically to create concept drawings for children from around the world. She would also help in the design of sets. Quote, I had 3 jobs, she explained, raising children, keeping house, and doing my artwork. The drawings that she created for the Disney dolls were reasonably similar to those that she had produced for Meadow Gold. When Walt saw some of her early work, specifically of European children at play, he knew he had picked the right person to create the attraction's style. In the end, the brilliance of her designs were largely focused in 2 areas. She was able to suggest similarities in children throughout the world from a range of racial and ethnic backgrounds by reusing character proportions for each figure featured in the ride. She was also able to suggest similarities in world architecture by relying heavily on simple geometric or organic shapes, in particular the circle, the triangle, the square, and the rectangle. The buildings themselves, such as the Eiffel Tower and the Taj Mahal, irregular in scale, were often skewed or slightly lopsided, as if these elements, too, had been cleverly constructed by children. In this way, the early design reinforced the basic theme of the attraction, that children from around the world and from diverse racial and cultural backgrounds shared not only similar environments, but also similar goals, desires, and longings. During these years, Mary Blair's sons were moving into junior high and high school. To effectively participate in the World's Fair project, she would need to commute from New York to California. Quote, Walt Disney was one of the most wonderful men in the world, she told one reporter. He was a family man, and he was willing to go along with all my commuting expenses. I would go out to Glendale about 7 or 8 times a year, do work I had to do there, then take the rest of the work home. Though her visual message was overtly framed in the rhetoric of a shared experience between nations, a softer and more poignant message was aimed at America, that diverse people within the same country shared the same goals of happiness, safety, and connectedness. This message certainly could not be lost on New Yorkers, where racial tensions and protest moved through the city. With Mary Blair producing design concepts, Walt worked to solve a second problem he faced with the Children of the World Pavilion. Though many structures at the World's Fair had been designed by internationally renowned architects, Disney and Pepsi would have no time to create a showpiece structure, as this attraction was a late addition. Within weeks of agreeing to the project, the Disney-Pepsi team had signed off on blueprints for a simple L-shaped show building, what one designer would refer to as a corrugated barn. The location for this little boat ride was also at the back end of the fair, far from the subway entrance and parking lots. For years, Walt had believed that guests in amusement parks were attracted by tall visual marquees rather than signs containing text. He had implemented this idea with success at Disneyland. The castle was a visual marquee to entice guests down Main Street. The enormous Moonliner rocket was a visual marquee to entice guests into Tomorrowland, and so on. Walt believed that to effectively direct pedestrian traffic to the far end of the fair, to literally a plot located right next to the elevated expressway, he would need an enormous visual marquee, what is sometimes called the visual magnet, to lure guests to the Children of the World building. Walt initially handed off design work for this visual marquee to Herb Ryman, who had contributed to Disneyland's castle. But he had trouble framing the idea for this ride into a large design. Quote, "I didn't do very well with that," Ryman said. "My ideas didn't seem to mean very much." After reviewing some of Ryman's concepts, Walt passed the project to Disney artist Rolly Crump. For a few years, Rolly Crump had been interested in sculpture that moved, specifically intricate mobiles. In his spare time, he had built them and even showed them as part of a rotating exhibit at the Disney studio that featured employees' art. In ways, movement in art was a common theme among Disney animators. Art school and art communities tended to hardwire individuals to look for unique ways of expressing a personal vision, one that is often tied to experience. A traditional painter or sculptor might look to express personality, narrative, and emotion through a robust still life. Animators, such as Ward Kimball and Rolly Crump, however, sought to incorporate their knowledge of motion into traditional art forms such as painting, sculpture, and craft collage. Quote, "Walt wanted something that was playful," Crump explained. "The building at the fair was kind of ugly too, so the tower became the marquee, and it had a childlike Tinkertoy approach." Like many of Crump's previous sculptures, the model was a playful arrangement of moving parts. By gesturing toward images of toys, specifically Tinkertoys and carousel animals, the tower embraced the whimsy of childhood and the innocence of youth, striking notes similar to those that Walt wanted inside the ride. This structure, created by Crump so far only in miniature, would eventually be called the Tower of the Four Winds, a giant piece of outdoor sculpture that would eventually rise at the edge of the fair, a set of poles lifting up colorful shapes and animal figures that moved with the wind. It was a visual invitation of pure whimsy, inviting guests into a ride where a political message of cultural and ethnic equality would softly open up around them, one presented with rich colors and music that would stand in sharp contrast to demonstrations and protests then exploding around the country. I'll be back next week with the second half of this story. If you're listening to these episodes as they release, we're now moving into summer. Next week, we'll finish up the cultural and design history of It's a Small World. The week after that will be our monthly news and analysis episode. And then we'll start moving into our longer series for the summer. These longer series take a good bit of effort and planning. I've been keeping notes on this upcoming story for about 6 years now. It will connect the early story of Disneyland up with the early story of Disney World. These episodes will begin to drop next month, and I'm pretty sure there'll be some stories in this that even the most dedicated Disney fan hasn't previously heard. I'm looking forward to it. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Walt Disney Company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.